Our first question comes from Charlie C., who is writing from Aliso Viejo in California. And Charlie asks, is punctuation the same in different languages, like when you're translating? And the first thing I'd like to say, Charlie, is I think that this is a fabulous question. It is a fabulous question for a number of different reasons, not only because I myself am, as a translator and as a writer, fascinated by the way that punctuation works in different languages, but also because it reflects your own understanding that punctuation is a part of language. Punctuation isn't necessarily something that we just impose on top of a language and that we might impose equally on all languages, but I think you've already had the sense within yourself of the possibility that each language might have its own system of punctuation. It might be similar to the way we punctuate in English, but it might also be different. So let's look at this question with a few very specific examples. The two languages that I myself know and translate from are Spanish and the South Indian language of Tamil. So let me begin with the more familiar language, or at least a language which historically and culturally is closer to English, which is Spanish. And the short answer is that Spanish has punctuation which is similar to, but not always the same as in English. And let me give you, in fact, an example. Let me see if I can pull up a screen here. Here we go. If this goes correctly, you will now see a screen where I can paste an example. Here is the Spanish equivalent of hello, how are you? Hola, ¿cómo estás? And just looking at this, you'll see that we have some familiar and some unfamiliar punctuation marks. We have the familiar punctuation mark of the question mark, for instance, and the familiar punctuation mark of the exclamation mark. However, we also have the much more unusual and in some ways intriguing upside down exclamation mark and the upside down question mark. And this is because one of the conventions in written Spanish is to indicate that a statement or a phrase or indeed an entire sentence is an exclamatory statement or sentence or an interrogative statement or sentence precisely from the beginning to the end. So the Spanish system of punctuation has the punctuation mark at the beginning of that sentence or phrase and as at the end of the sentence or phrase. That may look strange to us in English. That's simply because we're used to, in English, understanding when something is an exclamation or is a question based on the sentence itself, and we only need the exclamation mark at the ending. Here is a system which puts it at the beginning and at the end. So that's one example of a difference. Let me turn that off and continue being able to see you directly. There is also another difference, or set of differences, which is that the system in Spanish of punctuating quotations, as in dialogue between people in a novel, for instance, is also different. And for this, I can give you the example of a novel that I am currently working on translating from Spanish into English, which is Juan Rulfo's masterpiece, Pedro Páramo. And I've opened up, and I'm hoping that you can see here, maybe I'll have to hold it a little bit closer. Here is a page. You can see it has all my markings on it. And here we have several kinds of punctuation which are either not in English or much less common. For example, hopefully you can see where my finger is pointing. There we have the equivalent of a dash. And one of the ways that you can punctuate in Spanish is with a dash instead of quotation marks. Another way that is punctuated, that Spanish is sometimes punctuated, is, let me see if I can find it. There should be, right down here, you can see there's something, let me see, I'll have to bring it a little bit closer. You can see there's something like sort of two less than or greater than signs That's another way that dialogue, for instance, can be punctuated in Spanish. Just as we also have, as you can see down here, much more familiar, quotation marks. So there are a number of different ways that punctuation marks work in Spanish. And so in my work as a translator, I not only have to translate the language, but I also have to translate the punctuation into something that is more familiar to us. Now, one of the interesting things that you learn as you explore language and as you continue to learn and explore language and systems of punctuation is that, for instance, this, I'll hold this up again, there we go, this dash as a way of indicating punctuation is not entirely foreign to English. We actually do have it. And in fact, if you read James Joyce, he at times, for instance, in his book Dubliners or in his book A Portrait of the Artist as a young man, uses dashes instead of our more familiar quotation marks. And so, for instance, in my translation of this novel from Mexico, Pedro Paramo, I also use dashes so I can at least give the flavor of that aspect of the language. Although I can't as easily use, for instance, those two little sign symbols that look like that, just because that sort of goes too far from our realm of what is usual. Now, let me give you another example, which in some ways is maybe even more interesting, which is I also am a student of and translate from the South Indian living classical language of Tamil, usually spelled in English Tamil, and often pronounced in English Tamil, which is perfectly fine in English. The Tamil way of saying it is Tamil. And this is a language which for centuries did not have any punctuation marks at all. It didn't need punctuation marks because the language itself told us where we pause, where the end of a sentence comes, where in English we would put the equivalent of a exclamation mark or a question mark. However, during the years of the colonization of India, when the English language came with the British into the Indian subcontinent, there began a dialogue, a kind of interaction or encounter between English and the various languages of India, including Tamil. And so Tamil took from English the system of punctuation. And I can give you a visual example of that here. This is the cover of a book I've recently published, what's called The Qural, which is a book on ethics, power, and love. It's a kind of guide to practical philosophy or practical wisdom. And here in this cover, you can see the very, interesting forms of the written Tamil language. And if you look, let me see if I can bring this a little closer and get this. Yeah, if you look here, you'll see that there are indeed commas in separating some of the words on the cover. There were no commas in Tamil until Tamil encountered English. But now it is very common to see this use of punctuation in Tamil. However, in the old language, there were no punctuation marks. So in my translation, here is a copy of that translation, the Qural, I have tried to avoid using punctuation marks. And I'll give you one example, if I can pull it up. Friendship averts trouble, shows the way, and when trouble comes, stays. Now, if we were writing this as prose, we would include commas. We would say friendship averts trouble, comma, shows the way, comma, and when trouble comes, comma, stays. But because I wanted to give a flavor for how Tamil didn't need punctuation, I've taken out the punctuation so that the person reading the sentence out loud might experience the way that you can read without punctuation. It's a different kind of reading. Friendship averts trouble, shows the way, and when trouble comes, stays. Now, all of this prompts us to ask a question, which I see has also been asked by Charlie C. himself in the chat. Why do we have to use punctuation? Why do we need punctuation at all? Indeed, we can look at languages such as Tamil, where there isn't, and there hasn't historically been punctuation. And there is a very important answer to this question. which is this. When we speak with each other, as I get to speak with you here in this Ask Cozy Grammar session, we give a certain flavor to what we're saying by the sound of our voices, by the inflection of our voices. So, for instance, when I'm asking a question, by the tone of my voice. For instance, if I were inviting you into my cozy writing yurt, or if Marie were inviting you into her cozy beach cottage, we might say something like, "Would you like a cup of tea?" And by the way, I ask tea with the sound of the word sort of rising upward, we know, this is a question. And if I say something like, "The house is on fire," you can hear by the excitement of my voice, and not just the excitement of my voice, but maybe by the way I put my hands into the air, that I'm making an exclamation. I am saying something with a certain amount of emotion. Now, when we take those same sentences into a written form, when we write them out on a piece of paper, we don't hear the voice in the same way. We certainly don't see my gestures in the same way. So what punctuation does is it gives us additional information as to the tone of the voice, as to what is being said in the language. So we see that in English, the exclamation mark at the end of the sentence, and we know that we are saying something with some emotion. We see that question mark at the end of the sentence, and we know we are saying something with a different kind of tone. We are wondering something. How are you? Would you like a cup of tea? Where are you writing from? All of those vocal inflections that we give to those statements are telegraphed to us through our punctuation marks. I have another question here, which is a wonderful thing to include. We have a question from Tristan C. asking who invented punctuation marks. And this is a wonderful question. And in fact, I deal, and Marie and I both delve into this question in great detail in the basic cozy grammar course, especially toward the beginning there. I give a exploration of the history of punctuation marks, but I can encapsulate that history here by saying what Marie herself points out, which is that punctuation marks were basically invented by publishers because they wanted their readers to have the feeling of what their writers were saying. And so they started to use these different marks to suggest the pauses when we speak, the pause that a comma or a period might suggest, along with the tone of voice that a question mark or an exclamation mark might suggest. And over time, different publishers have come to a kind of agreement for each language. What is the system of marks which most helps readers to hear more of what is being said, to be able to organize their thoughts visually, to see what is going on? We also have a question here in the chat from Shirley, who goes on to say, is that why Marie says punctuation marks are like language traffic signs? And in fact, indeed, Shirley, that's true, that the punctuation marks are like traffic signs in the sense that they tell us when the language comes to a stop, like a stop sign. Or they tell us where the language slows down, like a comma, where we take a little breath and then we keep going. They instruct the reader how the language should flow through their experience, how the language flows through a story, just as punctuation marks help, just as the traffic signs on the road help traffic to flow smoothly and easily through an intersection or through a city. I also noticed the comment in the chat here where Amelia says that she likes your lesson on the history of punctuation marks in the Cozy Punctuation course. Yes, and I'm going to include a link to that and encourage you to watch that if you haven't done so already, because there I get to explore in much greater detail how punctuation marks came to be and what I think is really fascinating about them, which is that punctuation marks, uh, which may seem like a small matter of little dots and squiggles we put on the page, actually can become a doorway to our entire experience, not only of language, but of poetry, of language spoken out loud in such a way that the music of the language becomes alive, enlivened to us, enriched to us. And we have a much more full and indeed sensory experience of language. I see one more comment in the chat here where Brad, Shirley's son Brad, says Brad liked when Marie demonstrated saying a paragraph without any punctuation marks and how confusing it is without them. And in fact, Brad, that's a wonderful point. In English, before publishers started using punctuation marks consistently, things in English were written not only without punctuation marks, but even without spacing between the words. Let me show you what this looks like. I can give you an example. So here we have a sentence. Let me get it a little wider for you. So if you look at that sentence, can you read that sentence? It may at first appear like a jumble of letters. Now watch this. See if instead of trying to read that sentence silently, you try to speak it out loud. Then you might see, this is a sentence without punctuation marks. And indeed, before punctuation marks were widely used and before spaces were put in between words, the way that almost everybody read was by reading out loud, because reading out loud allowed us to hear what the sentence was saying on the page. So just watch the difference it makes to have that same sentence with spaces between the words. Let's see if I can get that to match more or less. This is a sentence without punctuation marks. Our eyes are so accustomed to there being spaces between words that we don't have to read every individual letter. We take in the word in a whole. This, I know what the word this looks like. Is such a common verb. We see is, a sentence without punctuation marks, and so on. And so this is the beginning of the process of, in English historically, this is going back, for instance, to the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries. Spaces are added between words, capital and lowercase letters are added, and then we get periods and commas and punctuation marks of those kinds. So that is an answer as best as I can give it in this moment to your question, Charlie C. I'd like to invite you, are there any questions that you would have? Anything further you'd like me to clarify? You can unmute and respond or ask. You're also welcome to put something in the chat. And if that is plenty to think about, you are welcome to just to think about it. And I thank you and commend you for your excellent question.